Good evening from Buckingham Palace. I'm Trevor Phillips, and welcome to a Sky News Royal Special on the death of the Queen. Coming up in the next hour, farewell to Balmoral. The Queen's coffin leaves her Scottish retreat as preparations begin for her funeral. The people, by their thousands, pay their respects and celebrate the monarch's life of service. The Queen, at rest in her Edinburgh palace before her coffin is placed on public display. King Charles will travel tomorrow to stand vigil with his mother after first meetings with the representatives of the Commonwealth and the realms. No break with the monarchy anytime soon, Australia's Prime Minister tells us, as the country honours the Queen.
It will need to continue to move with the times, but the bigger questions about our Constitution are not ones for this current period.
And flying the flag for the late Queen and the new King as the crowds continue to gather at Buckingham Palace. Good evening from Buckingham Palace and welcome to this special programme on the death of the Queen. Today, the decades of planning for this moment took hold. What the King has called his mother's last great journey began. In Scotland, the country she adored, a poignant progress managed with military precision as the late Queen's cortege travelled from Balmoral to be received by three of her children at Holyrood House, Edinburgh's royal residence. Here in the Mall, public emotion. The crowds keep coming, the carpet of floral tributes spreading outside the gates behind me. And inside the palace, in spite of the King's evident emotions, it's been down to business, a reception for diplomats from the other countries where he is now king, and behind the scenes, planning for the next 9 days and beyond. Our first report tonight comes from James Matthews on the Queen's farewell to Balmoral.
Through the gates of Balmoral, it was the quietest farewell. Rural Aberdeenshire, its birdsong and the rumble of the River Dee laid the soundtrack for a sight most saddening. The hearse carried the Queen's coffin wrapped in the royal standard of Scotland. The wreath on top was made from her favourite flowers, picked from the Balmoral garden. In the car behind, the Queen was escorted by her daughter, the Princess Royal, and her husband, Sir Tim Lawrence. The geography of circumstance had placed the Queen in Balmoral when she passed. At Journey's End, there will be a state funeral and set-piece ceremony. But between here and there, this was an informal farewell, an opportunity for the public to say their goodbyes. In Ballater, near Balmoral, they lined the streets. Here, they knew her as the Queen next door. Their village was her village.
We're so fond of this area. It's just a very, very sad day for us all.
Very emotional today and very proud to be part of the United Kingdom, so yeah.
It was so dignified, more than I thought it would have been. And the hush as she came through, and then you could hear the sobbing. I had a sniff myself.
I just found it really emotional. It's almost like saying goodbye to a family member. It's just really, really upsetting.
Tractors were positioned by the side of the road, an agricultural guard of honour, as the cortege wound a route through rural Scotland. Horse riders, too, formed up in a field by the roadside as it made its slow 6-hour journey south. This journey had been meticulously planned. Even if there was no public rehearsal, here in Bankery there was applause. Elsewhere, there was silence. Everywhere, there was respect and remembrance.
It was quite overwhelming, to be honest. I'm very, very proud to be here.
I've never come along to anything like this before, but just really felt that it was important.
It's an honour. It's beautiful. Once in a lifetime. It's not going to happen again.
People lined dual carriageways linking Aberdeen, Dundee and Edinburgh beyond, and they looked on from walkways overhead. Closer to Edinburgh, the cortege crossed the Firth of Forth via the Queensferry Crossing, a bridge officially opened by the Queen in 2017. Once in Edinburgh, the Queen's coffin was driven through the streets towards Holyrood, in the city's old town. The Royal Regiment of Scotland formed a guard of honour at the Palace of Holyrood House, and the Queen's coffin was received with a royal salute. It's being placed in the throne room overnight to allow palace staff to pay their respects. As the Queen was carried inside, a daughter curtsied to her mother, her duty done. This was day one of the Queen's long goodbye, which will span a nation that grew with her, and having learned of her loss, is learning to live with it. James Matthews, Sky News, in Ballater.
The Queen's coffin started its journey from Balmoral shortly after 10 a.m. The cortege made its way to Aberdeen, passing through Ballater, Arboyne, Banchory and Petercouta, and crossing the King George VI Bridge. It then travelled through the Angus countryside, past Brechin, and then on the Kingsway around Dundee. Finally, it crossed the bridge she herself had opened across the Firth of Forth and entered Edinburgh, driving down the Royal Mile to the Palace of Holyrood House. And from there, we're joined by our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills. Good evening, Rhiannon. You've been following this moment for moment throughout this long day. What are your reflections tonight?
Trevor, I think this was always going to be a day where we all got to stop and pause and really take in what's happened over the last few days. I think when anyone loses a loved one or someone they care about and fond about, the moment that you see the coffin is often the time that that finally starts to sink in. And this was the first moment that all of us, as members of the public, were able to see the Queen, to see her coffin in the hearse being driven away from her beloved Balmoral castle. And for me, it was really a journey, a very long journey, 175 miles, that in so many ways encapsulated two very important aspects of the Queen's life, starting at Balmoral, a private place, somewhere that she enjoyed so much time with her family, her friends, her relatives. She enjoyed her passions for horses, the countryside, spending time around her dogs. And also a place where in the last 48 hours or so, her family have been allowed to privately mourn and reflect. But then as she travelled away from the Highlands through the likes of Dundee, and we saw the crowds starting to come out, we saw the likes of tractors being lined up along the roadside, people walking into the central reservation to see the hearse go past. It really was a sense that a woman who had lived her life in the public eye, who had spent days and days of her royal life getting out, meeting people across the United Kingdom, around the world, it was time for her to again venture out in public. Of course, in the car behind was her daughter, Princess Anne, with her husband, Tim Lawrence. I think, again, family showing that still supporting the Queen is vital during these difficult days. And then we saw the hearse arrive at the Palace of Holyrood House, where, in essence, the official work was always carried out, where only in June we saw the Queen probably at one of her busiest weeks, where she had the ceremony of the keys, where she also attended other events, beaming from ear to ear, clearly enjoying being in Scotland. And today, a much more sombre moment as we saw her children greet the hearse, welcome Princess Anne, no doubt support her, as tonight they are inside the palace, again as a family united in that grief.
You mentioned two things there, Rhiannon, which I thought were particularly affecting. One was the, obviously not officially organised, line of tractors and the line of riders on the route. And the other was when, as you said, she arrived at Holyrood House and her three children were there. There was a curious and I thought rather touching moment where her daughter bowed her head in a rather formal gesture, but also, I thought in some way, a rather kind of affectionate gesture. What will happen tonight? As you say, the family is there with her, but what happens tonight and tomorrow?
It's interesting that you should mention that curtsy, and I think for the family, it reflects what we've already seen and what we'll continue to see as we run up to the state funeral, where you have a family who, in their tributes, will talk about Granny and Mama and talk about the Queen in the warmest of terms, and yet the official, the traditional, the customs are still carried out to show their respects. This evening, the Queen's coffin is inside Holyrood House, in the throne room. And again, it's a moment where royal household staff are allowed to privately pay their own respects. So they'll be allowed to go into the throne room and take time to pause. You have to remember that for many of those members of staff, they knew the Queen well. Some of them had served her for decades. And speaking to anyone who'd worked closely with the Queen, certainly in the last year or so, you hear how much they appreciated her kindness and her warmth. And yet now it's her royal household staff, those who knew her so well, who are now having to put the plans in place and enact those plans when it comes to these big ceremonial events. You can't imagine how difficult it must be for them. And we know, of course, tomorrow there's another big ceremonial day coming, and they prepare to welcome the new king, King Charles III.
Rhiannon, thank you. We'll speak again later, I think. Now, as people line the streets to pay their respects to the Queens, thousands of people have also gathered across the four nations of the United Kingdom to witness proclamations of King Charles III as the new monarch. Today, ceremonies were held at Cardiff Castle, Hillsborough in Northern Ireland, and at Windsor Castle and Edinburgh Castle.
Do now hereby with one voice and consent of tongue and heart publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign, happy of memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III. Three cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
Rhoddwyd am halas St James, a degfed dydd o fedi, am mlwydd ein harglwydd 2022 ar hugain.
To whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless His Majesty with long and happy years to reign over us.
Do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III. God save the King!
God save the King!
In the afternoon, the King held meetings with the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth and attended, alongside the Queen Consort, a reception of High Commissioners here at Buckingham Palace. A clear indication of the importance he's placing on his new role as head of the Commonwealth. Let's talk more now about the new King and the rest of today's events with the historian and author Anne Seber. Good evening, Anne. Thank you so much for joining us. I thought today the King looked pretty much like he's getting down to business, don't you think?
He clearly is. He has, after all, had 73 years to prepare for this, so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. I've noticed a few things where I feel he's obviously, continuity is the bedrock of what he needs to show, and he's doing that. But a few new things. His speech yesterday or the previous day showed emotion. So that's very new, that he's prepared to emote. And of course, by getting out of the car with the Queen Consort and mixing with the crowds, shaking hands without gloves, not being put out when someone in the crowd tries to kiss him. All of this is quite new. And the other thing I think is that he's trying to have an element of something modern by televising the ceremony of accession. Now, of course, this is a fine line between not spoiling the mystique of monarchy, not being too open, and yet being just open enough and sharing what's going on. So I think those are two important elements that I've noticed. Of course, you know, the Queen, the late Queen, his mother, embodied the national story. She was living, walking history. And for King Charles to try and create his own narrative of what it means to be British, I think he's working pretty hard already at that. I think we can see these different elements.
Yes, you're looking at pictures of him talking to people, and I noticed the attempt to kiss him, which, of course, is not the first time that's happened in his life, so I suspect took him back to his teenage years. But I thought your point about his, if you like, new openness, in some ways reflects perhaps what his mother and his father tried to do in opening up the monarchy with documentaries and so on. Do you think that he sees himself not so much as a break, but as a development, as a break with the past, but as developing what they tried to do with monarchy?
Well, I think, don't forget, the late Queen never gave an interview. So to that extent, it would be quite new. But I think it's showing that they're not frightened of the public. I think that's what's so important. And we've only seen a couple of days of it. But it does really seem that he is embracing this new role and didn't shy away from all of that. So that would be very important. The other element is, of course, as he creates the new narrative of what it means to be British, he'll have some very difficult issues. And the most important, you could argue, is keeping together the union. So to that extent, he's been greatly helped today by these potent images of the late Queen's coffin draped with the royal standard of Scotland. I mean, that's an extraordinary help for him, because it makes the feeling of being part of a union, this whole Scottish element to the early aspect of the mourning week, has certainly helped him in the feeling that Scotland is such a key part of the union. I think the other thing is, of course, his desire to be defender of faith, and we'll probably see more of that in the days to come. But as you rightly say, he spent today in meetings. The element of his speech that was very clear cut was that he's not going to be an interfering prince. He's going to give up all the aspects. He understands that as king, he can't continue with many of his the issues and the charities that he was so involved in. And I think it remains to be seen how that pans out. I would say he's done such fantastic work with the Prince's Trust, and it's an undersung achievement that he will have to find a way somehow to continue this enormous philanthropic work without being seen as a meddling or an interfering king. So I'm sure he's given all of these things a lot of thought over the last few years. It's just that we, the public, don't quite know yet how it'll pan out.
And indeed, in his address, he did say that others will carry out some of that work. Just very briefly, Anne, before we finish, one of the things that I was very struck by over the last couple of days, the viewing of the flowers, the walkabouts, the fact that he did an address to the nation within 2 days. Now, in the unhappy aftermath of the death of Princess Diana, all of that took days. Do you think the royal household learnt from that experience?
Of course, they've learned, and they go on learning. I think, if I've understood correctly, he did actually record his speech in advance, and I'm not at all surprised. He would have been choked up with emotion. Everyone who saw him commented about the genuine emotion, the red eyes, the tears. That's not to take away from the achievement of absolutely striking the right balance in that speech, as I say, full of emotion. And for me, the wonderful literary allusion that he ended with, "May flights of angels sing me."
Yeah. And thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to talk about this. Thank you.
Well, as the king prioritised stabilising the Commonwealth and the realms as he begins his reign, a key focus of attention will be Australia. Its Prime Minister said before the Queen's death that his country needs an Australian head of state. But today he told Sky News that he will not hold a referendum on becoming a republic during his first term in office. Instead, Anthony Albanese told us it was a moment to show gratitude for the Queen's service to Australia, the Commonwealth and the world. Cordelia Lynch reports from Canberra on Australia's admiration for the monarch.
The sights, the sounds of a new sovereign, a ceremony for a new era in Australia, under a king. The Queen was adored here. In death, they honour her. Even those uncertain about the institution The Prime Minister, a Republican himself, leading the tributes.
This is a land of cyclones, of floods, of natural disasters, and Queen Elizabeth always reached out to give that comfort to Australians at our time of need. And she was such a respected figure, regardless of where people stand on the political spectrum. That 70 years of public service, that devotion to duty, is something that holds her in such high regard.
Part of the success of Queen Elizabeth's reign here seems to be that people perceived her as being politically neutral. Do you think her son will be able to achieve that too?
I'm sure he's very conscious of the need to be above politics, and he certainly has always been that in terms of Australia. This, of course, is a substantial change. The only monarch that we have known in my lifetime and in the lifetime of most Australians has been Queen Elizabeth.
It's reignited a debate about a republic. Do you think in this moment that that is appropriate or perhaps even opportunistic?
Well, I am of the personal view, and I've made it clear that now is the time for us to pay tribute to the life of Queen Elizabeth II, to give thanks for her service to Australia, to the Commonwealth and to the world, and that is the focus that I have.
When it comes to the monarchy, do you think, though, Australians want to see the institution evolve?
Well, of course, and it has evolved, and it will continue to evolve. It will need to continue to move with the times. But the bigger questions about our Constitution are not ones for this current period. This is a period in which we are showing the grief that so many Australians are feeling at the moment, showing our deep respect and admiration for the contribution of the Queen to Australia.
She certainly had a powerful connection, and we've witnessed that firsthand here in Australia. And just to confirm, though, no referendum in your first term?
No.
In recent days, some politicians have openly pushed for a second referendum. But the man running the country isn't ready, and neither are they. They just want the right words to say goodbye. Cordelia Lynch, Sky News, Canberra, Australia.
The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, spoke earlier about the Queen's legacy and Antigua's plans to hold a referendum on becoming a republic.
Well, I think across the Commonwealth it's very important to recognise that every country will evolve in its own way according to their tradition and their wishes. I think the King will be an incredible head of the Commonwealth and has an ability to bring people together. I know that he has a very, very deep commitment to the Commonwealth. So, of course, different countries will evolve in different ways, but I think that the King will strengthen that bond with the Commonwealth.
Well, as we've mentioned, King Charles met senior diplomats from the Commonwealth countries today. One of them was Sir Iftikhar Ayaz, Honorary Consular Official for Tuvalu, and he joins me now. Good evening, Sir Iftikhar. You've been a diplomat for some time. How significant was it, do you think, that the new king met you and other representatives so early?
Well, Tuvalu, being an island state which is threatened by climate change, and even some scientists have predicted that it may not be in existence after a few decades. And especially our present king, King Charles III, has been taking very keen interest in the developments and the effects of climate change, particularly on small islands like Tuvalu. So the meeting today I had, the audience today I had, with His Majesty was actually very interesting, but obviously the very first thought on my mind, and which of course was a reflection of the minds of the Tuvaluan people, was the grief which we have all felt and which is in our minds in relation to the demise of our beloved Queen. Actually, the people of Tuvalu have been very faithful, very loyal, and very loving to the Queen. There have been attempts in the past to change Tuvalu into a republic. And there was a referendum last year, which people rejected. And they prefer to continue under the sovereignty of their beloved Queen. And this has happened in the past as well. There was a prime minister of Tuvalu who actually changed the flag of Tuvalu, and he wanted to remove the Union Jack from the Tuvalu flag. But he did not succeed. And eventually, the country, the people of the country, have stayed on very loyal and firm to the connection, to the attachment they always had with the Queen. As you would know, it is in 1974, during the reign of the Queen, that Tuvalu attained and achieved its independence. So that relationship continues to this day. And whenever I have met the Queen, I just
Sorry, do carry on.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that whenever I have met the Queen, and I have met the Queen a few times, he always talked about her experience of her visit to Tuvalu in 1982. She visited Tuvalu with Prince Philip, and they were carried from the ship to the shore in a canoe on the shoulders of the elders of the community. And that experience, she did not forget, and Prince Philip did not forget. And every time I met, they wanted to talk about it. And such experiences have made a great impact on those people who are far, far away in a remote and isolated island with all these problems related to climate change. And of course,
Forgive me, High Commissioner, I thought you finished, but just one question. You've explained, I think, very eloquently the affection in which the Queen, the late Queen, was held by the Tuvaluan people. Do you think that will extend itself to the new king? I think they're familiar with him already, aren't they? I'm not sure he's visited Tuvalu, but they will know him.
Well, you see, there are two factors here. One is the sentimental attachment that goes back to the history of that relationship, and it continues with the new king. And of course, the Queen had been a stalwart monument and a pillar for Tuvalu, and they very much relied on her support and on her love. And I'm sure this will continue in the present era of the monarchy as well. And our new King Charles III is particularly very keen to help the small island states, and particularly the countries which have problems with the environment sustainability. And actually, what is really needed in order to strengthen and continue this relationship is some concrete gestures of support and help.
What would that be, Sir Iftikhar?
Well,
what would such a gesture be?
Well, that will particularly be trying to materialize and implement the proposals and the resolutions of conferences like COP26. As you know, I mean, in the previous COPs as well, lots of promises have been made to help countries like Tuvalu to defend their shores from the onslaught of waves and water. And this problem still continues to exist. And Tuvalu particularly has received very, very little help to defend itself from these things. And therefore, I think since our present king has been very keen on climate change and sustainable environment, he will surely continue his vision of doing something concrete to help such islands. And I think this is really what is important. It is not so much rhetoric and talk and resolutions as the real resources. For instance, at a time, it was suggested that Tuvalu should build defense and protective walls around the islands. And an estimate cost was also worked out, but no funds came and no funds have been made available to Tuvalu to carry out that project.
So, Iftikhar, I suspect your message has been heard, probably in Buckingham Palace, but perhaps even more importantly in Downing Street. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's look ahead in more detail to the next 10 days and the schedule of events. Tomorrow, the House of Commons and the House of Lords will come together in Westminster Hall for a motion of condolence, which King Charles will attend and make a speech. After that, the King and Queen Consort will fly to Edinburgh. They'll go to the Palace of Holyrood House. Once there, they'll join a procession where the Queen's coffin will be taken from Holyrood House to St Giles Cathedral in the city. The procession leaves Holyrood at 2:35 p.m. and the service takes place at the cathedral at 3 o'clock. The King will then return to Holyrood for an audience with Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. He'll also attend the Scottish Parliament to deliver a speech. In the evening, the King will stand vigil with members of the royal family at St Giles Cathedral. On Tuesday, the Queen's coffin will be taken to Edinburgh Airport and flown to RAF Northolt. The coffin is then going to be transported to Buckingham Palace by road to rest in the Bow Room. Meanwhile, the King will travel to Belfast and visit Hillsborough Castle. In Belfast, the King will meet the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and party leaders. King Charles will receive messages of condolence and deliver a speech. The King and Queen Consort will also visit St Anne's Cathedral for a service of prayer and reflection. And after that service, they'll leave Belfast and return to London. On Wednesday, at 2:22 precisely, the King will lead the procession carrying the Queen's coffin to the Palace of Westminster, where the Archbishop of Canterbury will conduct a short service. The Queen's lying in state begins in Westminster Hall. It will last 4 days. On the morning of Monday week, the 19th of September, the lying in state ends, and the Queen's coffin will be taken in procession to Westminster Abbey for the state funeral service. Our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, joins me once again from Edinburgh. Rhiannon, talk us through the plan for tomorrow and what the different parts of it signify.
So again, it's going to be a packed schedule for our new king, King Charles III, and again will reflect those two things that are happening and have happened so far in terms of him immediately picking up the baton when it comes to the constitutional duties, but also mourning the death of his mother. And it was made very clear yesterday in a briefing that, yes, while he has got those important state duties to carry out as now our head of state, for him, the real priority is making sure that he can lead the nation and the royal family in this period of grief. Of course, it starts tomorrow, though, at the Palace of Westminster, where he will address both sides of the House. He will address the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So we wait to see exactly what he says in that speech. Of course, in the past, he has been at times been described as a too political prince. In his message to the nation the other day, though, he made it clear that he very much respects the constitution, the institutions that we have in this country when it comes to political process. So it'll be fascinating to listen to his speech. But then very quickly, he makes his way up here to Edinburgh, and again, we are going to see a time where both the royal family and members of the public are encouraged to pause and reflect and remember the Queen, because a service is going to be carried out at St Giles Cathedral. I think it's worth reflecting on how important the Queen's own personal faith was to her. In a Christmas message, she once said, "I, like so many, have drawn great comfort in difficult times from Christ's words and example." And just as we saw a gathering at St Paul's Cathedral the day after she died, we will see something similar happening at St Giles in the middle of Edinburgh. It won't just be dignitaries and politicians, though. It'll also represent every aspect of Scottish society, I'm told. Of course, not everyone can get inside that cathedral, but crowds, again, encouraged to line the route. And what will be most striking is the fact that we will see the Queen's children, led by the King, walking behind the hearse as it drives here from Holyrood House up to St Giles Cathedral. Again, the royal family very much leading the crowds when it comes to this moment of mourning. They will also stage a vigil by the coffin later on in the evening. And what's really important, I think, for members of the public, and something that is only happening because the Queen died here in Scotland, is then St Giles Cathedral is going to be open for 24 hours, and all of us, members of the public, will be allowed to stream past the coffin in order to pay personal respects. Of course, we anticipated that lying in state would always happen in London, but the first moment that members of the public will be allowed to do that will actually happen here in Scotland, taking place from tomorrow evening.
Rhiannon, will, as you say, this is the significance of her dying in Scotland is extremely important. The royal family, other than the King, all have separate titles. For example, Prince William, I think, is now Duke of Rothesay, as his father was. How important is the Scottishness of tomorrow's event going to be, do you think?
I think we will see this reflected in the fact that the King has made it very clear that he wants every nation that makes up the United Kingdom to be able to pay their own personal tribute. And there was a set ceremonial plan just here for Scotland, which will reflect the customs that are unique to this country. So we will see those importantly play out tomorrow. And for the Queen, Scotland could not have been more important, a place where during the summer she would come for rest, recuperation, of course, never away from those official duties, but at least a time at Balmoral to spend time with her family. But also, the official duties were very much front and centre here as well, of course. It was only around 12 months ago that I remember being here in Edinburgh as the Queen, at 95 years old, opened the Scottish Parliament here, the Parliament building just a short distance behind me. On that occasion, she was ably supported by the then Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. But despite the fact that we now know she was increasingly having mobility problems, she wanted to carry that out. And I think one of our guests today described it perfectly, that even in the saddest of times, actually, what this moment has done has brought the best out in people. So whatever political persuasion people are, whatever people might think about the continuation of a United Kingdom today, and I think the next run up to the next few days as we run up to that state funeral is a time for people to come together. And really we saw that in the crowds here in Edinburgh today.
Rhiannon, thank you so much. I know you'll be back on tomorrow. I hope you get some rest tonight. Queen Elizabeth was, through much of her reign, one of the most photographed and certainly most famous women on earth. It wasn't just the public who wanted to see her. World leaders, including 14 US presidents, were also amongst those who valued their time with her. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, reports on the Queen's global influence.
Her Majesty went ashore, accompanied by the Governor of Fiji.
She reinvented monarchy and took it to the world, from young queen to global megastar.
She was incredibly popular. I mean, she was like this multimedia star.
Her lifetime of travels would circle the planet 40 times over. As the world changed beyond recognition, Queen Elizabeth remained constant, confidant and confessor to presidents and prime ministers.
What's quite extraordinary is the love and affection they had for her.
And champion of a Commonwealth of nations and its 2.5 billion people.
The ability to come to your level and tell you that you are doing a good work meant almost everything to me.
As Queen of Canada for nearly 6 decades, my pride in this country remains undimmed.
We've become used to seeing the Queen on the world stage, but it was a role she envisaged even before being crowned.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
It was a promise she would honour from the very beginning, barely 6 months after her coronation, embarking on a tour of the Commonwealth. The royal couple drew enormous crowds.
Welcome was the word formed by some of the 17,000 children on Melbourne Cricket Ground. There was no doubt they meant it.
It was clear that this was going to be a very different kind of monarch.
The Queen, when she came to the throne, she was very young, but she had very clear ideas of how she wanted to shape her role, and definitively travel and international collaboration and building an international community, and particularly the Commonwealth, was so important to her.
The Queen and Prince Philip toured the Commonwealth for 6 months, taking in its vast size and diversity. By the end, the young Queen was already becoming a global icon.
It was Lower Broadway that supplied the ticker-tape snowstorm.
The status cemented a few years later, when she took New York by storm. Americans came out in their thousands.
Inside the Great Assembly Hall, 2,500 delegates and their wives rose to greet the Queen.
When the Queen went on her visits in the early days, no one had any idea she'd be so popular. They had no idea there'd be thousands of people. The advisors were really quite surprised by the level of popularity, the level of fascination, the level of the fact that everyone seemed to be out there on the streets who wanted to see a glimpse of the Queen. And she was incredibly popular. I mean, she was like this multimedia star. She was like the ultimate celebrity, bigger than a Hollywood celebrity.
On the maintenance of understanding between us, the future of the free world depends.
She was already mastering the arts of soft power. Her personal chemistry with leader after leader would prove one of her most effective assets.
Saw her with leaders like President Yeltsin, and sort of, again, the level of conversation and confidence, ability to observe your discretions and secrets was very high, and I think, got on well because he respected the Queen of having some enduring qualities that are not related to politics or the stage at which you're at politically.
Very few could claim to be on an equal footing with the Queen. Nelson Mandela was one.
I mean, she could speak very frankly with him because he was a prince in his own tribe, so in that sense he had an easy way with the Queen. He's the only head of state I've ever heard call the Queen Elizabeth.
At home, the Queen hosted world leaders, some of them less savoury than others, but treated them all with the same decorum and royal welcome. Her role was far from just ceremonial. She had a diplomatic importance with a global reach and depth politicians could only dream of.
We in Britain have often underestimated the immense impact that the Queen had on the whole of the world. With America, she had met 14 US presidents. Nobody in the world, not even in America, has met 14 presidents. And then taken a place like Ireland. She was pivotal in bringing about that rapprochement between Britain and Ireland in 2011. So a hugely understated but very significant influence globally. The monarchy continues. The monarchy will always continue. That's what it's designed to do. But will anybody coming in now have that same clout, that same footprint on world history. Obviously not.
The Queen and Duke of Edinburgh.
Driving the Queen's ambition above all was a passion for the Commonwealth, to see something good rise out of the end of empire. Its Secretary-General says the Queen played a unique role for all of its leaders.
You could tell her anything, and she'd never talk about it, and she had the wisdom and the generosity to listen and then to give really sage, quiet advice. And so I think if you had the privilege, as a number of us have, of seeing her interact with them, what's quite extraordinary is the love and affection they had for her.
I commend the Queen's Young Leaders of 2018.
But the Queen's love for people extended far beyond leaders and politicians. She had a passion for the youth of the Commonwealth. Like Derek Omari, who set up a charity for disabled children in Ghana, aged 19, singled out by Her Majesty for the Queen's Youth Leader Awards.
It was a day that nobody ever thought about. I, knowing where I grew up, never ever thought of in my life that I'll even leave Ghana to the UK and then come all the way to the Buckingham Palace and be honoured. And one of the things that really left, that has gotten stuck with me was the chance to meet her in person, have a conversation with her, her humanness and her ability to come to your level and tell you that you are doing a good work. Keep doing it, keep going on, and we are proud of you, meant almost everything to me.
For Rihanna Patterson, recognised for setting up a dementia charity, the Queen was a personal inspiration.
She was a young person taking on this leadership role, and she had to kind of find herself in it quite quickly. You know, there was a lot of formalities, a lot of rules, a lot to take in, and it was something that was quite sudden. So I think she is relatable in that regard, like taking on a stance at a young age.
The woman who took on so much in her 20s will go on inspiring so many other young people like her for decades and carry on travelling for as long as her health would let her. The Queen transformed the monarchy, turning it into a globe-trotting multimedia phenomenon, years ahead of her time, letting Britain punch above its weight in the world and leading a commonwealth of nations. Her death leaves a void as she is mourned by hundreds of millions far beyond these shores. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
The Queen was remembered at church services across the country and the Commonwealth today. The Archbishop of Canterbury said she had taught people as much about God as any other contemporary figure. Caterina Vitozzi reports on the congregation's remembering a devout defender of the faith.
She is the only monarch most of us have ever known. And today, at Liverpool Parish Church, the late Queen was mourned by some like a member of family. This was a special requiem service, a chance to remember an extraordinary life.
We give you thanks for her love of family and her gift of friendship, for her devotion to this nation and the nations of the Commonwealth.
The Queen's passing brings global cultural change and a new national anthem with unfamiliar words. Arthur Speed, who's 77, remembers the previous king, but the late Queen became his constant.
She was a one-off, wasn't she? What a lovely, lovely lady. Lovely. And when I was at sea, every Friday, 7 o'clock, we used to toast the Queen. But we've got to look forward to King Charles. Hopefully he'll do as good as his mum. I'm sure he will.
Church services like this one held here today and those indeed across the country and the Commonwealth have given people a chance to pay tribute to the late Queen. But in many ways they also reflect the way in which Queen Elizabeth II lived her own life. At her coronation 70 years ago, the Queen pledged to lead the Church of England. But the public pageantry was matched by personal faith. seen in times of celebration like Christmas Day trips to church, or more recently at the funeral of her late husband. Her role as defender of the faith will be remembered.
Her late Majesty taught us much, if not more, about God and grace, both in words and the actions that reinforce them, than any other contemporary figure.
That's lovely.
The Queen once said her faith guided her through good times and bad. It feels then particularly poignant that places of worship like Lichfield Cathedral in Staffordshire have become such focal points during this time of national mourning.
She was just like the nation's grandma, weren't she? Everyone just loved her. There was nothing not to love about her, really.
She's really important for everyone, and a lot of people looked up to her and thought she was amazing, really, and I did as well.
It's a sense many share, a feeling many will miss. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News.
It's a name which resonates with another era, Treetops, the remote Safari Lodge Hotel in Kenya, where Princess Elizabeth found out she had become Queen. Today, 70 years on, Her Majesty was being remembered there and by the community around it. Alistair Bunkle reports on the Treetops tributes.
On the 5th of February 1952, Princess Elizabeth attended a service at St Philip's Church in the foothills of Mount Kenya. She didn't know it then, of course, but within hours her life would change completely. Early the following morning, her father King George died and she became the Queen.
As we continue to remember our Queen, Queen Elizabeth II.
The pulpit was a gift from her and the Duke of Edinburgh, and her coat of arms still hangs in the church today. After her coronation, the Queen sent a section of the carpet that lay in Westminster Abbey that day to this small rural church, which must have had special memories for her.
She is part of the congregation. In the records, she's there.
She's part of your family?
She's part of our family, She's part of our family. And being part of our family, she is part of us. And we are also mourning her death. And we are also part of the family that is mourning.
She spent her final evening as a princess at Treetops Lodge in the peace and quiet of Aberdare National Park, surrounded by wildlife and sleeping in a treehouse on the edge of a watering hole. The treehouse was burnt down a few years later by the Mau Mau during the uprisings against British rule, but the hotel was rebuilt. And your father cooked for her?
My father cooked lunch for her, and she was telling us stories, how she was asking the question. Very jovial. She was making fun. Oh, the nicest very food. The food was very nice. They make jokes. Hey, because we have just get it from the farm right now. That is, oh, nice. I'll come back again.
What an honour, though, for your father. What an honour to cook for her.
Yeah, sure. It was a privilege anyway.
A handwritten note lists the animals they saw during their stay: waterbuck, baboon, elephants, and bull rhinos fighting in the morning. The Princess Elizabeth Suite is now the hotel's jewel in the crown. Memories of her stay are part of the history of this place.
I felt we have lost someone that had loved Kenya and Treetop Lodge as well, because this is the home of the royal family. So many people say this is her hotel. If you go outside and ask people, you said that's Queen's Hotel.
When Princess Elizabeth heard the news of her father's death, she cut the royal visit short and rushed back to London. But she returned to Treetops Lodge in 1983 to see the animals and the staff and spend time in the place where she enjoyed the final hours before her life changed forever. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News in Kenya.
That's all for this special programme. Coming up next is News at 10 with Gillian Joseph here at Buckingham Palace and Anna Botting in Edinburgh.